All right, this is actually going to be titled the first and second class of the spring semester.
Did you hear what we were just saying? That's what we were talking about.
Oh, but that way on the videos when you watch them online, it'll say first and second lesson.
Okay.
So if you're looking for the first lesson, we didn't have it last week. So we just combined these, called it 1 and 2. Now we're going back to the book of Micah. That's where we left off last semester. And so some of this material you may have, some of it you may not. But just again, the name Micah, who was like God, who was like Yahweh or Jehovah. Remember, we do not really know the proper pronunciation of God's name. And it's not because God didn't give it, but it's because the Jews, in a sense, I admire what they did. In another sense, they were wrong. But they felt God's name was so holy that they would not even pronounce it. And in some ways that's good, because people take God's name in vain so often today. And, you know, I don't want to hear people cussing. I don't want to hear people blaspheming. But I'd rather hear cussing every day than to hear blasphemy. Because that just irks me. It goes all over me. And it should, all of us.
Yeah.
I know somebody recommended a movie, and I can't remember what the movie was. Now, and they said, oh, it's a really, really good movie. And I said, well, is it clean? Because, you know, I don't know. And they said, oh, no, it's nothing bad on it whatsoever. And 2-3 minutes into it, if that far, they were blaspheming God, and I just shut it off. And I went to this person and say, you didn't hear that blasphemy? They said, well, I didn't notice any blasphemy. I'm thinking, if you don't notice it, then your conscience is seared. You should notice things like that. And it should bother us. It absolutely should. I mean, that made the top 10 on the commandments, isn't it? Not to take God's name in vain. Micah prophesied during a very rough period in the history of Israel of the north and even Judah of the south. It was a time of strife that was going on, a time of spiritual apathy. And that's the days we're living in today. You know, in fact, all these things, strife, spiritual apathy, apostasy, hypocrisy. This is, I opened up a newspaper, that's the front page of a newspaper. People are so apathetic about the things of God today.
There's that falling away of.
Yeah, it's that apostasy, they're getting away from things of God. It's just, we're living in sad times. Now, I believe that we can overcome this, and I believe God can bless us during this time. And I even believe we can have joy during this time. But we are living in a nation that doesn't really care about the things of God like they used to. It used to be if a young person was called into the ministry, and they would tell people whether these people are saved or not, they'd say, oh, that's great, that's wonderful. Now a young man says he's called to ministry, and people in the church say, why would you want to do that? Kind of thing, you know? And it's sad, you know. But that's the days we're living in. That's the days that Israel was living in, Judah even somewhat. The hypocrisy, we see so much of that today. Just very sad. The king of Assyria now is Sennacherib. Remember, there were several different kings of the north. Tiglath-Pileser, Ashurbanipal. Now we have Sennacherib. He became king of Assyria in 705 BC. The northern kingdom had already been taken captive by this time, about 705 BC. And Hezekiah, although they were not captive of the Assyrians, they were affected by the Assyrians, as any other nations at that time would be, that were not controlled by them, but they were definitely affected by them. And Hezekiah would have nothing to do with that. Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, God even protected him. And if you remember, God sent Isaiah to Ahaz with his son, his older son, and told Ahaz that God said that the enemy will not overtake you. And Ahaz didn't really care what the prophet said. And then Isaiah was told to tell Ahaz he can ask for any sign that he wants, and God will give it to him, as evidence that God will not allow the other nations to overtake you. And Ahaz's response was, I don't want a sign, I don't want anything. I don't want anything from God. And so God did not give him the sign that he would have asked for, but God did give a sign, and that was Isaiah 7, that Jesus would come, they'd be born of a virgin. So the virgin birth was foretold to Ahaz, which meant absolutely nothing to him whatsoever. But obviously to everybody else in the world, it should. In 701, Sennacherib decided now that he would take over Judah. Remember, the Assyrians had taken the northern kingdom, 721, so 20 years prior to this. And the northern kingdom was 10 tribes. The southern kingdom is 2 tribes. Now, territorially, their land was actually probably close to what the northern kingdom was, in a sense, because they did control all the way from Benjamin down to the Red Sea. So, population wasn't as much, but land size was. But it would stand to reason that if the Assyrians could capture the northern kingdom, 10 tribes, then to capture 2 tribes south would not be much. It would be easy to do. And I'm sure that's what Sennacherib thought would take place. So Sennacherib does move in and does capture 46 different cities of Judah. Remember, not 20 years prior to that, Assyria wasn't as powerful a nation as it is in these days. So they're much stronger, and they're going against 10, instead of 10, going against 2. So I'm sure that Sennacherib thought that we got this to be no big deal whatsoever. We could definitely overtake them. Moresheth was the hometown of Micah. And that's one of the cities that actually was destroyed by Sennacherib, the Assyrians. Where they not only destroyed the city, but took captive many other people. I would imagine some of Micah's own family members. Remember, a prophet could be from any tribe. A priest could only be from Levi. We talked about this last semester, just to repeat it there. Isaiah and Micah were contemporaries, meaning that they prophesied at the same time. So anytime you see the word contemporary like that, that's what we're talking about. Isaiah was of the royal family, so he did prophesy to the royal household. Whereas Micah was not royalty, and he prophesied more to the common people. But we need both. There's some rich people that I would never have access to, but there are some rich people that are saved that would have access to them. And so our mission field, wherever God places us at.
Well, both of those were on the take-home test.
They were, yeah. They're probably on the final exam too, wasn't it? I think so. very importantly, Micah's message was for them to act in justice and holiness. It was not too late for Judah. 721. In fact, excuse me, 701. In fact, they did go another 65 years before being taken captive. But God tells them definitely in the first 3 chapters that He will judge them for their sin. And then He also promised, very importantly in chapters 4 and 5, that God would have a king that would reign in righteousness. And I think it should be a familiar reference to you.
Micah 6:8.
No, yeah, that's
Yes.
one, but one I'm
Okay.
thinking of is Micah 5:2. Micah 5:2 tells us what? It tells us where Jesus would be born at. In Bethlehem, Ephraim. Yeah, I know. Sometimes it's put on the spot, and that's what happens to me. If you're not thinking about it, then you remember it. You know? But Bethlehem, Ephraim, there are anywhere between 2 and 3 Bethlehems in Israel at that time. Just like Walkertown here in North Carolina. If I told you to go to Walkertown, then you would think, well, it's, a mile from here, 2 miles from here at the most. But there's 3 Walkertowns in North Carolina. There's one down the other side of Raleigh, from what I understand, and there's one on Black Mountain. Now, the Walkertown here is the only one that's incorporated as a mayor. Mm-hmm.
I did not know that. And I didn't know it was that many Walker towns in North Carolina.
I didn't even, for some reason, I think I saw a sign at Black Mountain one time, Walkertown. That's what made me look it up.
I've heard you say it before.
Yeah. But God does convict Israel and Judah of their sin. They were definitely guilty. Even though Hezekiah is the king at this time, and Hezekiah is a good king, they still had to be judged for their sin. And just because the king is good did not mean that the people were good. I remember Josiah is the greatest king that Israel had up at this point. He'll be second after Jesus when it comes down to as far as the Bible is concerned. That tells that he was the best. But upon his death, he had 4 sons, all 4 wicked, and a grandson that was wicked, who became 3 of his sons, and his grandson became the last 4 kings of Judah. So just because Josiah was righteous didn't mean his children were righteous. And even David with Solomon, people. Solomon was a saved man, and he did get things right eventually, but he spent his whole life trying to find other things to bring him joy. He said he got him gardens, got him singers, gold, wealth, whatever. He sought all those things in Ecclesiastes, but he could not find what he wanted until at the end he says, here's a conclusion of the whole matter: fear God and keep His commandments. When he finally, near the end of his life, he got it right. And he spent all those years as a bad king, really. We always think of his wisdom and all that. People kind of promote him to this great biblical character, but he wasn't really that. And Micah warned them of the imminent judgment of God's people. I've said before, that I don't believe that America is going to be judged by God. I think we're already there. I think we're already suffering the consequences of sin in our society. The anger that people have today, the crime rate has risen dramatically. It amazes me because there's this huge anti-bullying campaign going on for our schools and all that. At least people talk about it anyway. And it's like one of the number one things, anti-bullying kind of thing. And I have no problem with that. That's a good thing. But then you turn on the media, whatever channel you turn on, and those people are send out hate remarks against other people back and forth. And so all you see on the news is hate, and then they say you shouldn't hate people. And yet all you see is hate. I mean, what's that do in our society? You know, so it's all parties are guilty in this, of just spreading more and more hate, but saying we're not bullying. And yet as you bully adults, that's okay, I guess. I don't know.
It's
Doesn't make
almost
sense.
like the commandments in the Bible, they take it and they switch it. If we say thou should not kill,
Yeah.
they're saying
Well,
thou should kill.
Well, the Bible says that there'll come a time when they call good evil and evil good.
Like, yeah.
And that's what we're seeing today. Then the coming of the Lord, mentioned in Micah, and of course we're talking about the Bethlehem coming of God. You know, we use the phrase first coming and second coming as theological phrases to indicate the first coming was the birth of Jesus, and second coming is when he comes at the end of the tribulation and before the millennial kingdom. But of course, technically, that is not anywhere close, right? Because in the book of Joshua, when Jesus saw the captain of the Lord of hosts, who did he see? Jesus. And so anytime God appeared in the Old Testament, it was Jesus. So I think, because I had one, he became a student, but he wasn't a student at the time. The church that he went to basically said that Jesus' beginning was at Bethlehem. And so that's when Jesus first came, and you know, that was his beginning. And this guy did get saved, and he was visiting the class with somebody else. And after class, he asked me about that, because I had mentioned something about the eternality of Jesus, and that Jesus in the Old Testament, Christophany is the word we use for that. And he was confused by that. So he asked me about it at the end of class, and he says, I've never heard that Jesus was eternal. And all, but could he still be saved and not believe that? Yeah. Yeah, because a lot of things we don't know about the Bible. And so I gave him some verses, and he came back to the next class, visited, I think visited about 3 or 4 times that semester, and then ended up coming to the college and graduating. But the next time he came back, I asked him about it, and he said, well, I'm still studying that. And so I gave him a couple other things. I printed out some stuff I think was given to him. And then the third week came back, I asked him about it, he said, I believe Jesus was eternal. You know, now, he really wasn't denying God in the first place, he just didn't know. Until he was taught that from the Bible, yes, Jesus has always been. The coming of the Lord will be judgment. And so, you know, with the arrival of the Lord here, we know judgment didn't come with Jesus' birth, but we do know that second coming. And it says God will tread on the high places. We've talked about that in other classes before, but high places, remember, were pagan places of worship. In fact, it's believed that the Tower of Babel, which is called a ziggurat, but at Tower of Babel, that the roof at Tower of Babel was there to worship the stars. And so people would elevate themselves to go up in the mountains to worship pagan ways, what have you. And what happened in Judah, as well as Israel of North, but in Judah, even though they did have a good king at the time, the people regarded the temple as a high place. Remember Psalm 121 says, verse 1, I will lift up mine eyes into the hills. From whence cometh my help? My help cometh from the Lord. The reason that verse says that is for a proper reason, is that when you go to Jerusalem, the only way into Jerusalem is by going uphill. Because Jerusalem was a city set upon a hill. But what people started doing is started worshiping the temple rather than worshiping God in the temple. As people do today. Sometimes they'll do it with their pastor. They'll worship him more than they worship God. I know of churches where when the pastor left, that half the congregation followed him. I know.
I do too.
You know,
Several.
and I know sometimes when the pastor leaves, that people get out of church altogether. Because they weren't following God, they were just following the pastor. I mean, I love my pastor here. If God called him to go to another church, if it was 3 miles down the road, that doesn't mean that's where God's called me to go.
Sure.
So I got to be where God wants me to be. If He wants me to go, then He'll let me know. If He don't, He'll let me know that. It's not the house that matters, it's the worship.
Amen.
Remember Jacob on his way up to Haran, stopped at Luz, the city's name had been separated, and changed the name of Luz to what?
Oh,
What's the question? I'm sorry.
Changed the name of the city Luz to name, what name?
right on tip. I'm like saying I'm
Very
having a
familiar
singing
name.
moment. Bethel.
Bethel.
Yeah.
See, it's we know it, but
Yeah.
sometimes it won't come
I
out.
get it. And Bethel means
House,
house. Beth means house.
God. God's house.
El means God's house.
Ah.
Right?
It was on my tongue. I heard.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
thank you.
When you come to change your mask,
Yeah,
we
I
can see
have
it.
the house.
Hey Jennifer, as long as
I have that.
it's coming from you and going to saying and coming over here.
I think it's bypassing me today.
Oh, no, it ain't that. It's in
remember-
there.
Remember what happened 20 years later? After Jacob came back down from Haran, he ended up going back to Bethel and called it.
It was not. Oh
Put a
Oh my
prefix.
goodness.
He put a prefix on Bethel.
gosh. El Bethel.
El Bethel.
El Bethel. E-L.
Right, because El means God, Beth means house. So he went to the house of God in the beginning. Later on, when he finally got right with God, he went back and called. They didn't change the name of the city, but he instead of calling it Bethel, he called it the God of the house of God.
Now, is this where the stones were put?
They did build a monument. to this
Okay,
thing,
I remember
reflect
that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so what God is telling us there, it's good to go to the house of God, but it's profitable to go to the God of the house of God. So not just into the building, but go to God.
That's good. Yeah.
Even nature itself tells us things that sometimes we don't think about, but
Excuse me.
it says, "And the mountains shall be molten under him, and the valleys shall be cleft as wax before the fire, and as the waters that are poured down a steep place." I mean, even nature itself was going to change. Remember when Jesus, at the second coming, he comes back to the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives becomes the Valley of Olives. So things change in the world.
Does Jesus' appearance on the Mount of Olives do that separation, or is it already separated?
No, I'm sorry, do what now?
Now, when Jesus comes back and he comes back to the Mount of Olives, and you say it becomes the valley of, does he separate that, or is it all?
I'm sure I think
His
basically
presence
when his
and-
feet touch the ground,
Yeah,
then
it's
separates,
separate,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to.
And we'll be somewhere behind him when our horse is coming with him.
So wonderful.
Of course, the reason for the judgment, very simple. Sin. The northern kingdom is often called Israel in the Bible, but sometimes it's called Samaria, and sometimes it's called, I don't have it up here, but there's actually no name northern kingdom is often referred to as.
Another name.
It's actually named after one of the tribes. It's Ephraim. Yeah. So, when you're studying, you see the name Ephraim in the Bible, you have to discern, is it talking about the person? Is it talking about the tribe? Or is it talking about the northern kingdom? And you know that by context, so you have to, that's why we have to read that. Whereas Judah could be a person, it could be a tribe, or it could be the southern kingdom. God's judgment, God's condemnation upon them because of sin. Nobody wants to be chastened, but chastening does correct us. I hear a lot of people say when they were young they got whipped by their parents and they were glad they did. At the time they weren't rejoicing over it, but later on they realized, you know what, I am who I am because I was disciplined in life. Because we're living in a society today where people don't want to discipline. And back in the 50s, Dr. Spock came out with his book on how to take care of babies and said you're not supposed to spank and you're not supposed to do all this negative stuff. And now some commercial, I don't even know what it is. It's like an Amazon Alexa kind of thing. You get and you put it in your house, and when your kids act up, you're supposed to do something positive through it. I don't even know what it is. Yeah, it's just about just positive reinforcement. It's making the parents to be positive when their kids mess up. Instead of disciplining the kids, then you get in your own little space and be positive. That's
You haven't said it in a while, say stupid.
yeah, that's stupid. Yeah.
You
Not
haven't said
stupid.
it in a while,
No,
have you?
yeah, it's not stupid. It's stupid.
Stupid.
Yeah. There's condemnation of Samaria, judgment. We see that in verses 6 and 7. Of course, judgment had came to the northern kingdom at this point. I mean, that's what God is reminding Judah of. So Judah, don't you remember there used to be 12 tribes? Why are there not 12? Because they split, but where are those 10?
Still there.
Yeah, as far as the nation itself, they're gone. Yeah, all 12 tribes are still there in the southern kingdom, but then the rest of the book deals with Judah itself. It doesn't have to talk a lot about the north because the north has already been destroyed. It just brings up the north because a reminder to Judah. If it happened to them, it can happen to you. Of course, the results of God's judgment, condemnation. Not only did they destroy Israel, whose capital was Samaria in the tribe of Ephraim. Remember, they took the stones of the city and basically threw them in the valleys. When people came through, they would doubt that any nation could have ever been there. The date right there says 722, but you'll notice a lot of times I'll say 721. The reason for that, it depends on how you count up, and which the Northern Kingdom New Year was in March, and the Southern Kingdom's New Year was in September. So there was some crossover time, where one would say the word year 720. Of course, nobody knew the dates at that time, BC, but one would say happened in 722, and the other nation would say happened 720.
Commentaries do the same way,
Yeah, they do.
because I get confused, sometimes I have to go back and look at my notes,
Yeah.
but the commentaries do the same thing.
And the dates in the Bible, the dates we put up here are extremely close. There's so much historical evidence for events that we can date many things in the Bible to the very year. Now, some things we can't. Some things we're kind of guessing at, but they would happen within within 3 or 4 year period of time, depends on. And of course, the reason for God's condemnation. This is talking about the northern kingdom here, verses 6 and 7. But the northern kingdom Israelites had degenerated so far that they now had temple prostitutes. Baal worship had become the national god of Israel. If you remember Jeroboam, who was the first king of the north, when Solomon died, God actually told Jeroboam that he would be the leader of the 10 tribes of the north, and Rehoboam, Solomon's son, would be leader of 2 tribes of the south. And one of the first things that Jeroboam did was he set up calf worship at Dan and at Bethel, and he got rid of all the priests out of the north. He kicked every Levite out of office and put in his own people, which of course was an abomination for God. But one thing he did know is that people by nature are religious beings, because we all know there is a God. I know people call themselves atheists, deny that, but deep down they know better. And I wouldn't argue with them because I know that they know there's a God, because God tells us that we all know that. They push him way so far that they think that there's not, but deep down they know. And every atheist I've ever known is an atheist because they were mad at God. Okay, how can you say there's no God if you're mad at him?
Right.
Exactly.
How did you get here in the first place?
Yeah, so it doesn't make sense, does it?
How did you get here?
Yeah, it's like being mad at Tinkerbell. Well, it's never reason to be mad at Tinkerbell because there is no Tinkerbell. Yeah. Right.
It's not. No, I'm just playing.
But we do see the sin here had taken over with no priest in the office. But Jeroboam knew that man is religious by nature. So the first thing he did was set up worship. Not pagan worship, but he set up worship. Golden calf at Dan and at Bethel. The holy days of Israel that God ordained, such as Yom Kippur we talked about, or Rosh Hashanah, the New Year. However long those feasts would last, if they celebrated in the south for 7 days, then Jeroboam would have a counter celebration right before it in the north that lasted longer. And so they would basically make north, they had a bunch of parties to celebrate their worship, whereas in the south they still did worship God in the right way. That's why, again, God condemned them. And then, playing off the depravity of mankind, used even prostitutes. If you go to a prostitute, that's worshiping God. Which, again, that's just the foolishness of man. All right, let's take a break.
That candy did, it woke me up.